Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Welcome, engagers. Once again, we have the Professor Game Podcast and a new episode, and today we are with Sarah. But Sarah, before we kick off, let's begin with this. Are you prepared to engage?
Absolutely.
Let's do this because Sarah Le-Fevre, is that right?
Yes, that's very good.
Sarah Le-Fevre is a learning design and delivery professional and is also certified as a LEGO Serious Play facilitator. After tiring of creating programs for blue chip clients that focused almost solely on growth and profit, she made the decision to keep the same audience but shift the focus to learning around sustainability, human flourishing, and tackling systemic wicked problems. With a focus on experiential learning, specifically in games and learning in nature, she specializes in creating programs which allow learners to reflect and create their own learning about complex systemic issues, and is in the process of writing a book about a systems practice approach to learning design for organizational change. And she also runs a bi-monthly online magazine called Ludogogy.
Ludogogy.
Ludogogy. That's it. I knew I was going to get it wrong. I heard you when we in the pre-interview chat, and I said that's the way to say it, and I'm going to say it wrong, and I did. So I lived up to my expectations.
It's a combination of Ludo for play and gogy from the end of pedagogy or andragogy, whichever you prefer.
Okay, so Ludogogy, which explores games-based learning, gamification, gameful, and playful design. So very, very much a medium we are interested in. And you can find her at sarah@gamesforgood.co.uk or search for LI for Sarah Le-Fevre with a hyphen. And you can visit the magazine at ludogogy.co.uk. Is there anything we're missing, Sarah, from that intro?
No, I don't think so. I think that's exactly right.
Seems we're all good. We should get started. We are excited about this, and we want to know, first of all, Sarah, what does a day with Sarah look like? What are you doing nowadays? What gets you excited? What gets you up in the morning?
Well, the first thing that gets me up in the morning is I go swimming. I have to be quite disciplined to get work done because I'm very prone to being distracted by the latest shiny thing that comes along. So the swimming is really good for me because it gets me up very, very early in the morning. I have to be in the pool by 6:30. But also it's very good for clearing my head and making sure that when I do get back to work, when I get back, that I'm very focused. As you mentioned, I'm writing a book at the moment. So the first thing I try to do is get some writing done while I'm still fresh from being in the pool. Most of my day at the moment, I'll be honest, is taken up with the magazine, with Ludogogy. So I spend a lot of my time talking to potential authors, writing posts to publicise the current issue, sending out appeals for the next issue. They're all themed, the issues, so always sort of sending out an appeal for the next theme. And I'm also working on a major revamp at the moment. So it's moving on from being just a magazine to what I hope will be a really valuable resource, community resource for games-based learning and gamification professionals. So that takes up a lot of my day. One of the good things I've found about lockdown is that I've taken to working in the garden in the afternoon, as a lot of people have, if they're lucky enough to have a garden. Yeah, that's nice. So I usually head out after lunch, and I can't get the internet in the garden. I mean, I could if I took a big cable with me, but generally speaking, it's quite nice to get away from it after a tough morning of Zooming. So I usually go out with the cat and work on some games projects or do a bit of reading. And I don't know about you, but I think my pile of books to read has also grown. I think lockdown has made that happen because everybody's got so much more time because they're not commuting. Everybody's got so much more time for networking and discussing the ideas they found with each other that I'm just being recommended books left, right and centre. So I've now got this huge pile of books to read.
Are you getting more reading now, or is it the same as before?
Yes, I think I am. I tend to read in the evenings. I read or play games in the evenings, which is quite nice. yeah, so that's kind of my day, and then I kind of fall into bed at midnight, and then start it all again at 6 o'clock.
That makes a lot of sense. You were talking about the books. What can I say? I have quite a few episodes getting recommended books that are of my main area of interest. So that every single week I have one or two new books that I would like to read. And I was getting back into my habit of reading more often. I was using some extra time I had in the morning because I've been doing some stuff for my physiotherapy, and I ended that with some ice. So when I was getting myself iced, I was reading as well. So that was a very, very good time to spend in at least 15 minutes every day. But the icing is gone, and so has been the reading for a few days. I'm trying to figure out how I can get it back in.
It's probably not worth injuring yourself again, I wouldn't.
Oh, I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's not. I'm way too busy to have those minutes sort of locked in any capacity. So yes, the books have been increasing for sure every single week, not just in lockdown, but I had managed to get into a habit of reading them in the morning. We'll see what that looks like in the future. It seems you have many exciting things going on, and we'd like to make a shift. We always like to start with sort of strong in that sense. We like to start with stories of a time that, things didn't go well. You were using these strategies, these game-based strategies, these Lego serious play, this gamification, all these things that we've been talking about up to this point. And, it was a first attempt at learning, just not to call it a fail or a failure. So we want to be there with you. We want to be in that story. We want to learn from it. We want to know how you got out of it, or what did you learn yourself.
So I think there's been quite a few of those failures, and I think that and hard-won lessons, I would say, and quite a lot of them, probably in common with a lot of your listeners, happened when I was starting out. And I think probably the hardest one lesson was that I shouldn't and couldn't shoehorn in my current favourite game mechanism into whatever I'm designing, just because I really, really wanted to use it. I've been a massive board game geek ever since I was a child, and I have a ludicrous selection of board games. So I've got a lot of reference and a lot of inspiration to draw upon. And it's very, very tempting, I find, to push in all the funky mechanisms you can. So I remember one particularly excruciatingly embarrassing situation. Fortunately, it was only it was a play test. It wasn't a for real out there in the real world with real learners. But it was a leadership learning program, and it was for quite a prestigious client. And I'd created what I thought was this really, really clever and wonderful market-based mechanism for measuring and rewarding different leadership behaviours based on decisions that people had made. As I say, it was market-based, so they had to bid for them. And as I'm explaining it now, it sounds ridiculous at the time. But, so when it came to the part where at the end of the round, they'd made their decisions and they had to reflect on their performance, which was fed out numerically to them. None of them were really interested in reflecting, so I was desperately trying to facilitate it in my best facilitating style. And all they really wanted to know was why they'd got this number, why this team had won and that team had lost, and what the numbers meant, and could I explain myself. So it really distracted from what I was trying to do. So I ended up having to explain my design for about 20 minutes and sort of justify myself. And as it was coming out of my mouth, it just sounded like the most ridiculous thing that anybody had ever invented. It was really stupidly complicated. And I just thought, well, people just make decisions. They don't have to competitively bid to make them. They might have to pay for the resources that they need in order to make those decisions, but they don't have to competitively bid to actually make the decisions. So this taught me quite early on that when I think I've got the perfect design, that I should really take a second and third look and probably strip out at least half of the working parts, because less is nearly always more. And what's really depressing about it is that I generally found, even now, that the cleverer I think the thing is to start off with, the more or the less likely it is to work in practice. So, the things I get really excited about are generally not the things that end up in the finished game. And actually, that's something which, I was thinking about this earlier. It's quite ironic, because the game I was just talking about came from a time when I was working with what I see now as quite simple learning outcomes for my learners, but creating quite complex games in order to facilitate that. So this, for example, was It was a leadership program, but the bit we were doing was around getting people to create and understand financial records. So we created this kind of business simulation, which had lots of moving parts and was about them running their own business. But the learning outcomes were really simple. It was, here's a profit and loss. Here's a balance sheet. This is what these numbers mean. This is what those numbers mean. And looking back now, that was a ridiculously complex and stupid amount of work that went into creating a game for a very simple outcome. And yet what I'm doing now is I'm quite often working with really, really complex outcomes. For example, helping a community or an organisation to really explore and get into how it's going to be resilient in the face of potential future challenges, which is, a complex set of outcomes. And yet the game that I create to do that might just be a simple set of stimulus cards, which is helping to draw out those stories and helping people do world building. So it's almost like the games have got simpler as the outcomes have got more complex.
Absolutely. That makes sense. That's a beautiful way to see it. I think, as you said, like you put it beautifully, less is more. And the more we simplify, I think is always very good. I remember a friend, Anne Coppins, you probably have heard of her as well, saying that when you're designing these things, of course, she's more into sort of professional and working with companies rather than necessarily with learners. So she says, like, every time you're thinking of building in some other mechanic, some other thing, think that each of these features costs, let's say, 10,000. Dollars, euros, British pounds, whatever that looks like. Every single time you add one of those, it's 10,000 pounds extra. In the end, it might be something like that anyways, but it helps you sort of keep yourself guarded off of creating too much, which I think is one of the big lessons of that story as well.
Yes, absolutely. Ultimately, though, I think my biggest failure, I would say, would be that it's taken me such a long time to kind of reach a balance of combination of purpose and design practice that I'm happy with. Because as I say, I spent quite a lot of time working, creating games which I think you alluded to in my introduction, where I was working with companies, and it was really all about helping these companies to make more money. Not that I've got anything against that, but for me, that didn't really get me out of bed in the morning. It wasn't something that really excited me. And then even when I then moved into working with organisations that were more purpose-driven, the problem I had then was around my practice, because there would be quite deep misunderstandings about what games-based learning is, what it's good for, what it's not good for, how serious games can be, because there was quite a lot of feeling that games can't really be used to tackle serious issues because they're really for children. And even, misunderstandings about how long it takes or what skill set is needed in order to actually implement games for learning well. I can tell you a really, one of my favourite, I use the word favourite quite sarcastically here, one of my favourite requests from this time in my life was being asked to create a game for a corporate reception, which would be both engaging but wouldn't distract people from drinking and networking, which was quite an interesting request. So I eventually ended up doing something that sort of enhanced the networking, but I was really met with a lot of blank looks when I tried to explain that the word distracting or not distracting and engaging are actually mutually exclusive, and there's really only one of those you should be going for when you're designing a game.
Well, maybe you try to not distract them or try to focus them on what they should be focusing on, and that, depending on how you see it, it is a distraction or it is actually focus. So yeah. It's hard to get that through. However, I can completely understand and relate to that. And of course, it's really hard, and it's one of the struggles that I think we all face at some point in a certain capacity. How to get people to understand that games can be these awesome things that are not just fun or sometimes fun, but also sometimes serious and or fun. Yeah, they can absolutely be many things in the middle. So I think it's a struggle to a certain capacity we all get to have.
Isn't necessarily a synonym for frivolous.
Absolutely.
I'm a great believer in the fact that we should all be having fun all the time, because fun is the best way to learn, and learning is also the best fun you can have.
Absolutely. And we could get into the discussion of how we stripped education and learning the fun, but maybe that's not for today. Maybe it's for later on. I think we could spend a full episode just talking about that, because we would like to know as well, because we talked about these failures that you've had, and that's very exciting because we get to know you a bit more. Some people get to understand you've not always been, not only you, all of us, we're not always been, or if we are at all, fabulous and all showing all these great things. We've also had failures. That's human. That's where we learn. That's where we can do also, we build from there to actually become fabulous, right? Mm-hmm. And I'd like to talk about a fabulous occasion now, right? Of a time you set out to do something, you had this project you were very excited about, and the first or the second or the nth time you attempted to your have at it, you had at it, and it was a success. And we want to be there with you. We want to know if there's any sort of factors of success that you had there. We want to see that story, hear that story.
Well, I'm going to be a bit contrarian here because I'm actually going to pull out a story which is from this time when I was working in my sort of helping corporates to make money period. But having said that, it was a project that I got very, very excited about. And it was the start of my lifelong love affair with Excel spreadsheets and VBA, which I still have today. I think the thing about this project, which was so fun, is that it was really just like a huge puzzle. And one of the things I'm probably going to talk a little bit about later is the fact that I find very stimulating working with constraints. I think constraints and being told that you haven't got a lot of money, or you have to stick to this particular piece of software, or you can only run your game between this hour and this hour in a day, or whatever, are actually things that can really stretch your creativity and teach you a lot. So this particular thing, I was called upon to create. It was a simulation, really, rather than a game, I would say, although it was played as a game. But it was basically a working model of the supermarket promotion process of a large food manufacturer. So if you've ever been in a supermarket, you've probably been faced with buy one, get one free offers or 2-for-1 offers and so on and so forth. So the way that these work is that food wholesalers and food manufacturers bid for these opportunities. Well, they bid for product placement within the supermarket. So it costs them the most money to get the eye-level shelf with their product on it. It costs them money. They have to give money to the supermarket in order to have their products at the gondola end, at the ends of the aisles or by the tills and so on. And then they also give money in order for the supermarkets to run these promotions, these buy one, get one free things and so on and so forth. So there was there must have been about 12 of these different instruments that I had to model within a spreadsheet, plus all sorts of other bits and pieces like the price elasticity that happens as a result of these. But not only that, I kind of started modelling it in Excel and said, okay, right, I've done the prototype. Right, we better do it in a nice, programming environment now that's got some nice graphics, and we can program in some non-player characters and so on and so forth, because of the other bits that you've asked for, which are that the output will be a graphical representation of what the supermarket looks like after the 6 teams have competitively bid and made their decisions about how much money they're going to spend. I went, oh, no, you've got to do it all in Excel. It's the only thing we can use. So I had to build this thing that really, really should have been built in, as I say, a nice graphics-based programming environment with non-player characters and lovely graphical outputs that would show me the plan of the supermarket with all the product placement and so on. I had to build it in Excel, and I did. And it was a massive puzzle, and it took me quite a while, but the things that I learned about VBA and how far you can push software and as I said, the creativity that can come about when you're faced with what seems to be an overwhelming constraint, I think, is something that is a really, really valuable lesson to me, and I'm still very proud of it. It makes me feel like that I am to Excel what Eric Clapton was to a guitar every time I look at it.
Well, we can tell that you were excited about Excel at that point,
yeah,
right?
Very much so.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's a wonderful prototyping tool. I don't think it's been battered for that.
The interesting thing about Excel, I would argue, is that I don't know of many people who can actually, know it all in Excel. I mean, you can get to be incredibly amazing at so many things, and still you would be at a certain percentage of all the
Yeah.
insane things that Excel is able of doing. I think at this point, not even the ones who created it really know every single function there, right?
Yeah, I mean, who would have imagined you could build, a graphical representation of product placement in a supermarket using Excel? I wouldn't when I started that project.
It's crazy. It's crazy. So that is fantastic, Sarah. And it's an example of, those restrictions you were talking about. It's an example of you don't need necessarily all these tools and these 3D typical graphic environments. There are things that can be done with, it can become super complex and do super complex things, simpler things that do simple things, simple things that do complex things. There's all these combinations in between, and it depends on what you're looking for and what are your restrictions. And Sarah, you've been talking about how you face these projects, but do you have any sort of process? Is there a way you approach when they tell you, oh, let's make a game out of this, let's create this experience? How do you do it? What comes to your mind? What are the steps, if you have any?
So I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and then I wrote a few notes down, and I actually look at it and I think that doesn't look like a process at all. It looks like a big mishmash, but I guess that is kind of my process. I do occasionally create just for fun games, but most of the time when I'm working, when I'm doing my professional bit, I'm creating games to support learning. So until relatively recently, I would have started that process with the standard AAA objectives, outcomes, outputs process to decide what the learning should look like before I even look at the games. But I've become quite disillusioned with that process or that approach. Particularly, I think, again, as I've moved into areas where the learning's more complex and it's more about organisational change or community change than necessarily individual learning within an organisation, which is where I was, before, when I was doing leadership programs or financial acumen programs and so on. And I think it's because it seems unreasonable to make the assumption that individual learning outcomes will necessarily aggregate into some kind of organisational change. So I've had to kind of adjust my approach. And this actually, it's not too much of a plug because I won't go on about it too much. But this is basically what the book I'm writing is about, and it outlines a more systems-based design approach, which is a bit more like transition design. Have you come across transition design?
Nope, no. I haven't.
So transition design is quite often it's something that's looked at in terms of sustainability learning, or not learning, but sustainability and resilience around things like climate change. So you might come across things like the idea of transition towns and so on. The idea is that we live in very transitional times. Climate change is the big one that's rumbling on in the background, of course. But I think this year it's become even more obvious that we live in these very transitional times. Obviously, COVID-19 was something that made a big change in people's lives. And then during the time that's going on, there's been an upsurge in the interest in Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth. So there's all these big changes in society, all these pushes for change that aren't necessarily happening. And the idea behind transition design is that as designers, this goes for any designers, they might be architects, they might be town planners, but I would argue it applies to learning designers too. They really have a responsibility to be thinking in terms of how they can aid those transitions, which are going to happen. We're going to have to transition, for example, to a situation where we are more resilient to repeated pandemics. So that's basically what the book is about. I won't go on about it too much more, but just to say that to get to that completed learning design aspect, there is an awful lot of games and play involved in that. So I would use games and play to do that analysis and do that work with the stakeholders before I even start thinking about the game. So it's all very meta. There are, games that I play with stakeholders to decide what the games we should play for them to do the learning. So if we kind of get to that stage, if we sort of say, well, let's say we've got to the stage where we've got a kind of workable model of the change we want to bring about, then I can then start to look at what games experiences might help support that. And as I mentioned earlier, probably I would say the start of my process is always with constraints. And although it might seem a little bit depressing to start with things that you can't do, because most people like to start with things that they can do, because that gets them a bit more excited, I think that they're a major help to creativity, because they give you a problem to solve. And if you don't have a problem to solve, if you're given what to a lot of people would seem to be a dream project, where you're told, yes, you've got as much budget as you like, and basically, it's up to you. You can decide how it works. I think that doesn't give you an awful lot to sort of anchor your thinking on. So knowing that you've only got a certain amount of money, or the game must run in 2 hours, or you have to do it in Excel because that's the only thing they've got to run it in, actually it gives you a problem. And when you have a problem, you can actually start working to solve it. So as I say, by this stage I will have been playing games. I would have been using Lego series and so on to work with the stakeholders, find out what it is they want to achieve from the learning, creating things like productive fictions to analyse and start to work through the ideas. Sometimes, and this is as I say, this is where it starts to sound like it's not so much a process as some kind of mishmash, but sometimes I'll end up using games that maybe I've worked on a different project to actually play through to see how they pan out, or to see how people react to them. So everything I learn up to that stage will feed into sort of brainstorming or prototyping stage, and we'll start to suggest, I guess, along with the constraints, potential mechanisms, themes, and other bits of gameplay. And again, at that stage, I'm very much into the idea of playing games to design games. So at that stage, I will be taking playing pieces out of commercial games to work on ideas. I love Jesse Shell's lenses. I use those incessantly. And I have those in card form as well as the book, which is great because it allows me to play games with them. So as an example, I had a game that I was looking to design quite recently about sustainable cities. And I'd been working with the stakeholders to come up with some ideas about the kinds of learnings we wanted to come out of it. And I had a game called Flip City, which is quite a simple game, but it's about building a city. So I dug those out. I dug out my Jesse Shell lenses, and we just made up a game with those playing pieces, spread them out on the table. What does this suggest to you? And we just played around. So I do a lot of that, which I said, it doesn't really sound like a process, but generally speaking, what happens is a kind of weird co-creation process with stakeholders, where workable ideas turn into prototypes, turn into play tests, and we get something useful out of the end of it. And one of the other things that I find is that when I'm designing, even outside of that process, so when I go home in the evening, I find that it's almost because I'm designing, I'm playing more games, and in my spare time as well. And very often a key mechanism or theme will come out of that. So it's almost like if you open yourself up to lots of stimuli when you're working on a project, it's almost like your subconscious is working in the background and will dig out the right answer for you. So there was an incident that happened quite recently. I was working on a disaster readiness simulation for a charity, and I was playing a lot of games in the evening, and just one evening I went, I really fancy playing Scotland Yard tonight, and I hadn't got a clue why. I hadn't played it for years, literally I hadn't played it for years, but it just occurred to me I'd really like to play it, so I played it with my daughter. I played it with both my daughters. And then partway through the session, I suddenly realised that the map and hidden position mechanic is absolutely ideal for this disaster readiness simulation. So it's almost like if you take on enough stimulus, the ideas will occur.
There you go. There you go. There's so many things. It's so packed, Sarah. Thank you very much for all those insights. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. Talking about insights and things that you would recommend, is there, hearing these questions, listening to the interactions that we've had here, is there somebody that you would like to listen to in an episode like this one in Professor Game, some person that you have in your mind?
Absolutely. The game that I find most inspiring in the field that I work in, which is as I say, talking about these big systemic problems, it's not a recent game. It's World Without Oil. Have you heard of it?
Nope.
World Without Oil. So it was an alternate reality game that was created, must be coming up 12 years ago now, by Ken Eklund and Jane McGonigal. And the premise behind it was that we had reached peak oil. We'd reached a situation where the demand for oil had outstripped supply. And this was run over a period of a few weeks. I think it was 32 days, which was supposed to simulate 32 weeks. And every day the game makers would feed some stimulus into the game through websites, through TV programs. It was quite a broad infrastructure that was put in place. And people were invited to play. And the way they were invited to play was not role playing, but real playing. So they would read this stimulus and enter into the magic circle, if you like, of accepting that this was reality. So they would respond to this reality in whatever way they liked. They were writing blogs, they were phoning up a helpline, they were writing comic strips, just really to respond as themselves as to what their life would be like in this situation. And I'd say this went on for 32 days, simulating 32 weeks of this oil shortage, basically. And to start with, the way that people were playing is they were sort of writing quite gloomy responses about how difficult their lives would be, how they couldn't take the kids to school, how they couldn't run their farms, etc., etc. But over a while, people started to self-organise into groups and start coming up with solutions. So what actually came out of this game, which is quite a long-term game and a game that a lot of people played, is a resource which is still available and which people can still use as a learning resource. It's used quite widely in schools in the US, which really looks at how communities would deal with this crisis if it actually happened. So it's sort of the idea behind a game like that is that people can play it before it happens, play it before you have to live it, and it helps to make people ready. And as I say, the two creators of this game were Ken Eklund and Jane McGonigal, and I'd love to see either of those two, or both preferably.
Wow, so that is all about Jane McGonigal, and that would be your favorite game as well, right?
Yes, that would be my favorite game. Yeah.
And the person you're proposing would be Jane McGonigal. I think I've said this many times before. I know she's been mentioned before. Many, many people are looking forward to having her on the show. Let's see if we can have her soon enough or in a special episode or what have you. I hope she will be very, very soon. And in that same sense of recommendations, you've talked about the person, you've talked about the game. Can you tell us if there's any book, we've been talking about books from the start, that you would like to have?
Yeah. So if I put it down here, so there's two books actually, and it's probably cheating a little bit. So it's a book that absolutely blew me away quite recently. It's called Ideas, Arrangements, Effects, and it's not actually a games-based book, but it is a design book. And the idea behind it, or the premise of this book, is that ideas are held or embedded in arrangements, and those arrangements have effects. So one of the examples they give in the book, which is very, very simple, is they talk about the lots of ideas around what learning is or what education is or how children should behave or what attention looks like is quite often held in the arrangement of chairs in a classroom. So if you arrange chairs in a classroom all facing the front in rows, that embedded in that are a lot of ideas about who holds the power in the classroom, who holds the knowledge, and how that should be transferred from teacher to student. There are other examples in there as well. One of the things they talk about is the way that large problems are often tackled or often thought about in terms of, rather than ideas, arrangements, effects, ideas, people, and effects. So when you're talking about a big idea, such as racism, and you're looking at what's happening in the States, for example, with police shooting black men, quite often the blame falls on the police. So they say there is this idea, racism, and this idea is espoused by these policemen because, look, they're shooting these black guys. Whereas if you were looking at it from this IAE point of view, it doesn't necessarily take the responsibility away from individuals, but it also looks deeper at the hidden things that we might not think about. What are the arrangements in society that make these ideas persist? Another example is we think about things like an effect, like disparity of pay between men and women in the workplace, and we look at that and we say, oh, well, this company is being sexist because it doesn't pay its women as much as its men, but we don't necessarily look at the societal arrangements that are invisible, like the working day, for example, is an arrangement that we accept so much that it's almost invisible and unexamined. And yet the working day makes it difficult for women to retain value in the workplace because it's at the same time that they need to be looking after their kids, or ideas like what motherhood is or arrangements around that are holding women back as well. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, this company is bad because it's doing this. There are these invisible arrangements around us. So that is a really, really interesting book that I've read. And yeah, and I forgot what the other book was I was going to recommend.
That's okay.
It's also a design book, which has also had some really amazing stuff in it. And that's called Design Unbound. And that's a general design book as well. It's actually written by 2 architects, but there's so much stuff in there that can be applied to games design, particularly the chapter on world building, which just blew me away.
Well, those are some fantastic, phenomenal books. Thank you very much. We have a final quick question for you is, what do you think is your superpower?
My superpower is something that I only discovered relatively recently. And it's the same superpower that I apply to everything. But it wasn't a superpower until I learned to give it a name. I recently discovered that I have attention deficit disorder. And up until I discovered that, it was almost entirely negative. It meant that I picked up and dropped interests very quickly, sometimes within days or weeks. It meant that I had quite a big intolerance for certain sensory and emotional stimulus. But it also meant that I could hyper-focus on things, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing at all times, because it sometimes meant that I would forget to do other things that I should be doing. And I had quite a hard time with it, but it was mostly around other people's reactions to the way I was that led me to be quite negative about it. But when I discovered what it was, and it wasn't me just being flaky, I discovered there's a lot of superpowers that go with it. And I think the biggest one is the fact that somebody, certainly from observing myself and in conversations with other people who have ADD, that being quite eclectic and being able to pick up a new interest and being obsessed with it for a week and then you just never touch it again. But what that does is it does expose you to an awful lot of different stimulus, which means I think that I make connections where other people don't see them. And that can be very, very useful when creating games, because it's a real aid to creativity. The hyperfocus enables me to get stuff done in a hurry. Now I know what it is. And also, another thing, and I've got no evidence of this, so I may be entirely making it up, but another thing that I've noticed around with myself and potentially talking to other people with ADD is there does seem to be a tendency to think of things as very connected systems. And it may just be a symptom of the people I've spoken to, and maybe I'm quite selective, but I think it has helped to lead me towards this very connected way of seeing things and the practice that I'm now sort of engaged in.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for that. I think we've had an episode packed with a lot of great information and great things to keep thinking about, for sure. And before we go, can you let us know, Sarah, where we can find you? I know we mentioned your email, the Ludogogy, the magazine. Is there anything else that you want to mention? Where can we find you? Where can we chat with you if that's the case? As
I say, LinkedIn is probably the best place. It's where I spend a lot of my time. If you just search me on LinkedIn, and it's Sarah Le-Fevre, with a strange extraneous hyphen between the le and the fevre, which I don't think any French person would ever spell the name in that way, but it ended up there. I inherited it through marriage. It wasn't mine to start off with. So, yeah.
Well, so there you go. There we can find you. You can find that definitely in the show notes. You go to professorgame.com. You put the search bar. You click Sarah. You in the search, you put Sarah with an H at the end. And you will definitely find this episode. All the links that we've mentioned to all the things that Sarah has been talking about, we will hopefully have them all there. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for all this experience that you've shared, all of these ideas that you've had. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Sarah. And I would like to make you a small, very quick question. How are you listening to this podcast? Are you doing it through any sort of podcasting app on your phone or on any other device? If you are listening through one of these apps, have you subscribed, rated, and reviewed this podcast? That is, subscribing when you click on subscribe to get all the updates. Rate is when you say it's 5 stars, it's all good, very good. And then the review is that comment that you leave after saying that you do enjoy this podcast. If you haven't, please go ahead and do so. That way you can help us achieve the mission of making learning and life and business amazing using games and gamification. If you want the instructions, all you have to do, the basic ones at least, is go to professorgame.com/iTunes. And before you go on to your next mission, please remember to subscribe using your favorite podcast app so you can listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.